In our first session, we're going to consider the opening statement of the Apostles' Creed and give a little bit of historical background to the creed itself before we tackle the content of it. The word creed itself comes from the Latin verb credo, which means what? We have some pastors here that I know. Believe. It means I believe, huh? And the idea for a creed, which many people find somewhat distasteful in the 20th century because there have been so many controversies and so much hostility generated over church creeds and confessional statements, and so many people have said, well, why do we even need any creeds at all? Because as history would indicate, the earliest Christian creed, traced back to the New Testament itself, was very simple. It was the simple affirmation, Jesus is Lord. Jesus ho Kyrios. Jesus is Lord. And then, as we try to put the pieces of history together, because not all of the documents from antiquity have survived, and some of this is conjecture and scholarly opinion, but the general consensus is that the idea of creeds emerged rather gradually, beginning very early in the New Testament time period, in the early church, with catechetical questions and formulas. Somebody wanted to join the church, and before they were accepted for baptism or for membership in the church, certain questions were posed to them. Do you believe that Jesus is Lord? Do you believe in one God, the Father Almighty, and so on? And so the creedal statements were really either baptism or catechetical formulae given to people who wanted to join the early Christian community. And then as time passed, the church began to make positive creeds rather than interrogative creeds, that is, question and answer type formulations. And usually those kinds of solidifications of doctrinal confessions and creeds are provoked by some problem that the church engages. Just as, for example, the canonization of the Scriptures was brought about because the church was under attack by the Gnostics in the 2nd century. Well, also church historians tell us that this Gnostic movement, which threatened to undermine the Christian community in the 2nd century, provoked the church to establish what they called the church's symbol. Not symbol in the sense that we use the term symbol as a sign or pointer to something beyond itself, but rather it was that which incorporated the essence of the church's faith. And so at first we had what was called the Roman symbol, which contained, for the most part, the basic outline that is now found in the Apostles' Creed. And then as the years passed, certain other tiny points were added to the Roman symbol, which wasn't really finalized until somewhere around the year 400. But the Roman symbol was in use certainly in the 2nd century and maybe even at the end of the 1st century. And since its content dated to apostolic times and was built upon the message and the proclamation of the apostles, the later revised and amended version of the Roman symbol began to be called the Apostles' Creed. Not because it was written by the apostles in the form that we know it, but because it had its roots in the apostolic teaching and through the tradition of the church. So that as soon as we talk about the Apostles' Creed, we got to put that to bed right away, that it wasn't written by the apostles, and it's a creed that took literally centuries to reach its final formulation, but the essence of which was already operating in the 1st century Christian community. Now,
when you ask how important creeds and confessions are, from the very earliest time in the history of the church has not only proclaimed the truth of sacred Scripture, but has had to deal with distortions and radical departures from biblical truth in the appearance and occurrence of multiple heresies that have threatened the church from the very beginning. And one of the earliest creeds, in fact, what is thought to be the very first Christian creed, was the simple statement, Jesus is Lord. And that came out of the context of a loyalty oath that was imposed by the Roman Empire, where Christians were required to say publicly, Kaiser Kyrios, Caesar is Lord. And the Christian church in the first century would be quite willing to render civil obedience as much as they possibly could, but they balked at that statement, Kaiser ho Kyrios, and they said in response to that, Jesus ho Kyrios, Jesus is Lord. And when you look at the great creeds of church history, for example, the Nicene Creed, the Chalcedonian Creed, you see that they were written in response to serious heretical views that were arising, threatening the very essence of the Christian faith. And that's true also of the historic confessions that were written. These confessions were an attempt to crystallize the essence of doctrine found in sacred Scripture, never to be seen as a substitute for Scripture or having authority over the Scripture, but rather to give to us a summary of what Christians believe as defined in terms of confessional orthodoxy.